What if I told you a decision made in Washington could raise prices across the world? It might sound dramatic, but in 2025, it's already reality. This year, the United States slapped sweeping new tariffs, essentially taxes on imports, on a wide range of goods from nearly every major trading partner. These weren't small adjustments. By late 2025, the average effective U.S. tariff rate rose to levels not seen since the 1930s, far above what it had been for decades, and consumers and businesses alike are starting to feel the effects. At first glance, tariffs might seem like something that only affects giant multinational companies or foreign exporters. But here's why everyday people should care. When the U.S. applies a tariff, it acts like a hidden tax on goods you and I buy. Importers have to pay more to bring products into the country, and most of that added cost doesn't stay with them. It gets passed on to retailers and eventually to consumers. That's why families going to buy a refrigerator, a pair of shoes, or furniture now often face noticeably higher prices, not because general inflation is rampant, but because of these specific tariffs. Let's put that into perspective. Research from economic policy analysts estimates that the tariff increases of 2025 could raise the overall price level by more than 1.2% in the short run, which translates to an average loss of roughly $1,700 of purchasing power per household in 2025 alone. For many families, that's like paying an extra car payment each year just because of trade taxes. And it's not just the US feeling this effect, because the United States is one of the world's biggest markets. When it raises tariffs, manufacturers and exporters around the world start redirecting supply chains, shifting production, and renegotiating contracts to adapt. These changes send shockwaves through global supply networks, increasing costs not only for American consumers, but for producers and consumers in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America as well. For example, recent data shows that some types of manufacturing imports, like plastics and resin goods, have declined sharply in 2025 as companies adjust to the new tariff regime, while imports of machinery and equipment have risen because firms are scrambling to secure inputs that bypass the steepest duties. This isn't abstract economic theory, it's happening right now. Even industries that once seemed insulated from trade policy are navigating higher costs and uncertainty because global supply chains don't operate in isolation. When Washington changes the rules, prices everywhere tend to follow. This is not just a trade policy, it's a global economic chain reaction. What's happening with U.S. tariffs in 2025 isn't just a minor adjustment to trade rules. It's one of the most disruptive changes to global commerce in nearly a century. On April 2nd, the United States launched a comprehensive tariff program that slapped a 10% baseline levy on most imports, with substantially higher reciprocal tariffs, sometimes reaching 20% or more depending on the country and sector. These measures covered a staggering 86% of U.S. imports, far beyond typical trade policy shifts. Now understand what that means in practice. Tariffs don't just raise the price of an imported widget, they ripple through the entire supply chain. Companies that once sourced parts from one region are suddenly facing higher costs and longer delivery times, forcing them to reroute supply lines, retool production, or absorb extra expense just to keep operations running. One major study on supply chain disruption from earlier in the year found that tariffs have fundamentally shaken how global production networks operate, driving firms to rethink where they make and buy goods. Imagine you're a manufacturer in Southeast Asia selling components to North America. Overnight, your cost structure changes because your U.S. buyer has to pay more at the border. Instead of buying all your shipments directly, your client may seek alternative sources, change how much inventory it holds, or even delay orders until tariffs ease. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. Many businesses have already reported increased transaction costs and adjustment burdens as they try to adapt. And it isn't just raw materials or parts. Finished goods and services get caught up in the same web of rising costs and uncertainty. As tariffs went into effect, sectors like plastics saw notable shifts in trade patterns, with imports of resin and finished plastic products falling significantly, while machinery imports rose, a sign that companies are scrambling to maintain production viability amid trade friction. This is what it means to say that tariffs trigger a global economic chain reaction. They don't sit static in legislation. They move through economies, prompting business strategies to shift, capital allocation decisions to change, and trade volumes to fluctuate. It's a dynamic process that touches industries and families far removed from the initial policy announcement. Every time the US raises tariffs, someone else picks up the bill. A lot of people think tariffs are a cost borne by foreign countries, but the reality in 2025 is very different, and it's far more harmful for everyday Americans. Recent economic analysis shows that when the US hikes tariffs, the majority of the cost doesn't fall on foreign producers. Instead, most of it ends up being absorbed domestically by American consumers and businesses. Estimates suggest that U.S. households could be losing roughly $1,700 to $2,300 per year in real purchasing power because of these tariff policies. That translates into less cash for groceries, utilities, school expenses, or saving for the future. Here's how it works. A tariff functions like a tax on imported goods. Importers pay more to bring products into the U.S., so retailers and manufacturers often raise the prices of everything from clothing to car parts to compensate. When clothing tariffs rose in 2025, analysts found prices for items like shoes and apparel increased by roughly 28% to 40% in the short run, far outpacing general price trends. But it's not just consumer prices that rise. Companies that depend on imported intermediate goods, raw materials or parts used to make finished products, are squeezed too. Those higher input costs often lead businesses to raise their own prices, postpone hiring, or delay investment in expansion. That's a double hit. Consumers pay more, and workers face slower wage growth or fewer job opportunities. This effect is especially clear when you look at pricing patterns across categories tied to global imports. For goods like electronics, appliances, and other durable products, prices have climbed above their historical trends in 2025, even when overall inflation hasn't surged as fast. That suggests tariffs are feeding directly into consumer prices, not just the broader inflation picture. The structure of the tariff regime in 2025 hasn't helped either. Policymakers rolled out a mix of reciprocal tariffs on specific countries alongside broad blanket levies on many goods. That patchwork approach means that companies importing similar products from different countries face very different costs. Yet there's no easy workaround. U.S. firms still pay more, and those costs trickle down to consumers. Think about a furniture maker in the Midwest that buys wood panels from Canada or a construction supply company importing aluminum beams. Tariffs that raise those inputs don't protect American industry. They raise operating costs for firms with no simple alternative supplier. When businesses pay more, consumers pay more too, either through higher retail prices or because the companies delay wage increases, hiring, or expansion plans to protect their bottom line. And the data backs this up. Business surveys in 2025 show that the share of U.S. firms identifying tariffs and trade barriers as their top economic concern jumped sharply, more than threefold in just one quarter. That's a clear signal that tariff costs are dragging on business planning and pricing decisions. Because these extra costs are spread across essential sectors, manufacturing, construction, consumer goods, the everyday spending power of American families is taking a hit. Even if a household never directly purchases foreign-made products, they still feel the impact when businesses pass on those tariff-related price increases. That's how the bill of U.S. tariff policy ends up being paid largely at home, by Americans, not by foreign exporters. The biggest losers of U.S. tariffs are not always foreign countries. You might assume that when tariffs go up, only foreign exporters lose out, that factories abroad struggle to sell goods, or that other nations' workers feel the pain. But the truth in 2025 is more complicated and far more damaging for Americans than many people realize. Since the broad tariff rollout early in the year, U.S. consumer confidence has dropped sharply. By December 2025, the Consumer Confidence Index had fallen to 89.1, the lowest level since tariffs began, with inflation and tariff-related price pressures cited as major concerns on household surveys. That's not just a number, it means millions of families are feeling less secure about their finances, job prospects, and everyday spending as prices climb and uncertainty persists. What does that drop in confidence look like in real life? For many households, it translates into delayed buying decisions, tightened budgets, and less discretionary spending. When people start hesitating on big purchases, like cars, appliances, or even vacations, that slows the economy because consumer spending accounts for about two-thirds of total U.S. economic activity. And it's not only consumer sentiment that's under pressure. Tariffs on imports from key neighbors like Canada and Mexico, historically America's largest trading partners, have added friction to supply chains that many U.S. manufacturers depend on. Higher input costs for things like lumber, electronics, vehicles, and industrial components make production more expensive, squeezing profit margins and often leading companies to push rising costs onto customers. These disruptions don't stay confined to factories. When foreign suppliers face higher trade barriers, they sometimes try to absorb some costs to stay competitive, but that often means reduced production, slower deliveries, and lower inventories. That's how tariff effects can circle back and hit U.S. consumers indirectly, even when the goods aren't made abroad. Higher final prices, delayed shipments, and slower investment decisions all feed into a less dynamic domestic economy. Consider this real-world behavioral evidence. In mid-2025, consumer spending surveys showed a large portion of American households tightening their budgets, prioritizing essentials over discretionary buys, and avoiding big-ticket items due to economic uncertainty. More than half of consumers describe themselves as cautious or pessimistic about the economy. That shift matters because when households pull back, businesses feel it almost immediately. Lower demand for goods and services causes companies to slow hiring, delay wage increases, or even cut back on jobs altogether. Tariffs might be designed to protect certain industries, but when the broader economic confidence falters, the result can be fewer jobs and less wage growth overall. So while foreign exporters see lost market access or reduced sales, the broader economic damage often circles back to affect everyday Americans, not just wealthy investors or multinational corporations. Americans pay higher prices, make tougher spending decisions, worry more about the future, and ultimately end up bearing much of the cost of these tariff policies. Tariffs are not just about trade, they're a geopolitical weapon. In 2025, the United States didn't frame tariff increases merely as economic adjustments. They were pitched as tools of strategic leverage in global politics. Behind the tariffs were not just higher duties, but a push to reshape economic influence, counter perceived unfair practices, and assert geopolitical priorities. This shift has real economic consequences. When tariffs become a means of political pressure, they don't just affect trade flows, they introduce uncertainty into investment decisions, supply chain planning, and corporate strategy across the world. Part of this geopolitical strategy involved so-called reciprocal tariffs, in some cases reaching very high levels against specific partners. For example, in 2025, the U.S. applied steep tariffs, sometimes more than 25%, on imports from key trading partners, including China and other large exporters, as part of its broader policy stance. These moves were meant to protect domestic industries and counter external economic power, but they also strained international relationships and increased market volatility. Countries targeted by these measures rarely accept them passively. Brazil, for instance, saw its tariffs on U.S. imports rise after the imposition of U.S. duties, escalating from around 10% to 50% within months, and responded with formal appeals to global trade bodies and reciprocal tariffs on U.S. goods. That kind of escalation transforms trade policy into a broader diplomatic and economic standoff, rather than a narrow tariff adjustment. This geopolitical use of tariffs creates a climate of policy uncertainty that affects business and investment decisions. Firms facing unpredictable tariff risks are more likely to delay capital spending, scale back expansion plans, or avoid long-term hiring commitments. Economic research suggests that tariff uncertainty, even without immediate price hikes, can dampen investment and hiring simply because firms hesitate to commit resources in an unstable policy environment. For the average American family, this plays out in indirect but tangible ways. Higher costs for imported inputs reduce factory productivity and can slow wage growth. Partners abroad reduce their purchases of U.S. exports when they face political pressure from their governments. The combination depresses demand for American goods overseas and creates downward pressure on U.S. economic growth. Research using historical and current tariff data finds that prolonged tariff escalation tends to reduce real household income over time because of these broader effects. So while tariffs might be marketed as tools of economic strength or strategic power, turning them into geopolitical weapons comes with significant economic costs. They increase uncertainty, discourage investment and hiring, and can slow growth, not just in targeted sectors, but across the wider economy. The last time the U.S. did this, global trade slowed sharply. When the U.S. dramatically expanded tariffs in 2025, it didn't just change some tax rates, it reset the global trade landscape. Starting April 2nd, the U.S. imposed a 10% tariff on nearly all imports, with much steeper reciprocal rates on hundreds of specific products and countries, creating a trade policy shock not seen in generations. Economists who model these changes consistently find that such tariff escalations reduce real income and trade flows, both domestically and globally. One economic analysis showed that increases in tariff rates, for example, 20% on imports from China and 25% on steel and aluminum, raise effective import costs significantly. For every dollar of imported Chinese goods, costs can increase by more than 20 cents once tariffs are fully factored in, squeezing both businesses and consumers. That added cost doesn't stay in the background. It shows up in decisions firms make about whether to invest, hire, or even sell abroad at all. When companies see their input costs rise and face uncertain trade conditions, they pull back on expansion and production. Analyses have found that tariff increases are associated with lower real U.S. income and slower economic activity because households and firms alike have less to spend and invest. But the effects aren't limited to the U.S. economy. Global forecasts have been revised downward as a result of tariff fallout. Models from international financial institutions show that tariff-driven barriers can shave multiple percentage points off expected global growth. For example, one forecast adjusted its outlook and now predicts that global GDP growth in 2025 to 2026 could be about 0.6 percentage points lower than it would have been without recent tariffs, a shift that translates into trillions of dollars less in global economic activity. Here's why this matters for families around the world. Global trade isn't a narrow corner of the economy. It's the framework that allows goods, parts, and services to move efficiently across borders. When trade slows, imports become more expensive, supply chains become less reliable, and investment decisions get postponed. That means fewer goods on shelves, less competition, and slower economic growth. In the U.S., these trends have been evident in consumer prices and business sentiment. Durable goods like appliances and electronics, categories heavily exposed to global supply chains, are now priced noticeably above pre-tariff trends, even as headline inflation stays moderate. Those price shifts are direct evidence of tariff effects showing up in everyday markets. Firms are also reporting tariffs and trade barriers as one of their top concerns, a dramatic shift compared to previous years. When businesses are more worried about tariffs than about financing, regulation, or labor, that tells you something about how deeply current trade policy is affecting investment planning and economic confidence. So when you hear people say tariffs will protect jobs or they help domestic industry, the broader data paints a more complex picture. Taxing trade this aggressively slows economic activity, complicates global supply networks, and ultimately reduces prosperity for producers and consumers alike. One tariff leads to retaliation, and that's how trade wars spiral out of control. When the United States imposed broad tariff increases in 2025, including a baseline 10% tariff on most imports and much steeper duties on specific trading partners, it didn't happen in isolation. These actions immediately sparked responses from other countries and introduced reciprocal trade barriers that intensify economic costs for all sides involved. Trade retaliation is essentially a feedback loop. One country raises barriers to incoming goods, and trading partners react by taxing the aggressor's exports. Over time, this can erode market access and reduce global trade volumes. In 2025, retaliatory tariff announcements emerged across several major economies, with some partners imposing tariffs of their own on U.S. goods or threatening broader trade restrictions. These reciprocal measures shrink opportunities for exporters, dampen demand abroad, and increase risks for companies operating across borders. The effects are not merely theoretical. Empirical research shows that sweeping tariff escalation, particularly when coupled with retaliation, tends to contract trade flows and lower economic welfare. A detailed economic analysis using trade simulations found that the 2025 tariff measures could trigger sharp trade contractions and major disruptions to global supply chains, with direct trade between large economies potentially collapsing where tariffs escalate most intensely. One clear example is the automotive sector. Recent data indicates that German auto exports to the U.S. fell by nearly 14% in 2025 after European car tariffs were raised to roughly 15%. This reversal ended years of export growth and highlighted how trade barriers on one side can reduce foreign demand for American imports and for goods that cross borders multiple times during production. This dynamic plays out across industries. When foreign markets impose tariffs on U.S. products, American firms lose customers, reduce production, and face rising inventories. Many then delay investment or hiring because future revenue is less certain. That's not just a matter of lost sales, it's a negative signal on economic confidence that influences corporate behavior and labor markets. The human cost compounds as the cycle continues. Economic modeling suggests that, under scenarios of prolonged escalation and retaliation, global employment losses could exceed tens of millions, disproportionately affecting informal and low-skilled workers who have fewer buffers against economic shocks. At the household level, this retaliation spiral shows up in slower wage growth, fewer job openings, and greater economic uncertainty. Workers in export-oriented sectors like auto parts, machinery, and agriculture can see job offers delayed or downsized when overseas demand drops. That's how trade policy, which looks abstract on paper, transforms into real income risk and job insecurity for millions of families. The bottom line is stark. A single tariff rarely stays isolated. It invites retaliation, triggers broader protectionist responses, and gradually tightens global trade. In a deeply interconnected global economy, this retaliation feedback loop reduces trade volumes, slows growth, and elevates economic risk, often long after the original tariff was introduced. You may never see a tariff, but you'll feel it when prices rise. Tariffs might sound like abstract economic jargon, but in 2025 they're directly shaping the prices you see at the store. Tariffs act as taxes on imported goods, and when those costs get passed along supply chains, everyday products become more expensive. Research shows that 2025 tariff measures are raising consumer prices, squeezing household budgets, and influencing inflation dynamics beyond headline numbers. For example, early analysis of tariff impacts shows that items like shoes and apparel have seen short-run price increases of roughly 40% and 36% respectively, compared with what they would have cost without the 2025 tariff structure. Even after years, prices in these categories are projected to remain significantly higher than they would otherwise be. Those higher consumer prices aren't limited to clothing. Broader research indicates that tariffs in 2025 are associated with higher overall price levels, with U.S. real GDP growth down by about 0.5 percentage points over 2025 and 2026, unemployment up, and almost 500,000 fewer jobs than would have occurred without the tariff wave. Those are real changes that influence household spending power and lifestyle decisions. Tariffs also drive inflation in indirect ways, as firms adjust supply chains to avoid high duties. When companies reroute imports through alternative suppliers, hold more inventory to avoid delays, or pay extra for compliance and documentation, those costs are built into the price of final goods. This ripple effect pushes up prices for a wide range of products, from clothing and electronics to home goods and vehicles, even if consumers never directly think about tariffs at checkout. In practice, this means that although few receipts say tariff tax on them, families feel the impact in higher costs for everyday items, from shoes and shirts to furniture and appliances. For many households, these tariff-linked price rises amount to hundreds or even thousands of dollars in extra annual spending, tightening budgets already strained by broader economic uncertainty. So while tariffs aren't written on price tags, the effect shows up in the prices we pay and the choices we make as consumers, especially for households balancing rising costs on essential and discretionary purchases alike. That's the real, everyday impact of a policy that might otherwise seem distant or technical. In a globalized world, can any country truly win a trade war? As we reach the last part of this story, it's time to answer the big question that's been building throughout this video. Can any country actually come out ahead in a trade war? After watching the effects of sweeping U.S. tariff policies unfold in 2025, the evidence points to a stark reality. No one truly wins when trade barriers rise across the global economy. First, let's talk real impacts on growth. Major international institutions and analysts have warned that broad tariff increases reduce economic growth both in the U.S. and globally. In 2025, economic forecasts showed that global growth might slow by nearly 0.3 to 0.6 percentage points as a result of tariff hikes and retaliatory measures. Not catastrophic on its own, but significant given already modest growth projections. That downward revision reflects lost output, higher prices, and reduced trade volumes compared with an environment of lower tariff costs and smoother trade. For the United States specifically, the tariff surge is linked with slower projected GDP growth. Independent forecasts by organizations like the OECD suggest that U.S. GDP growth could slow noticeably compared with recent years, with elevated tariff costs contributing to a near stagnation of investment and slower job creation, despite temporary boosts in specific sectors. Now let's bring it home to how this actually feels for average families. Consider that by late 2025, consumer confidence in the U.S. had dropped to some of its lowest levels since the tariff rollout began, with surveys revealing that rising prices and uncertainty about jobs and inflation were key concerns for households. That drop in confidence doesn't just show up on graphs, it influences real spending decisions, from delaying big purchases to tightening household budgets. That tug on consumer sentiment matters because consumer spending drives roughly two-thirds of U.S. economic activity. When people cut back or delay purchases, businesses see lower demand, which can slow hiring and dampen growth even further. That's a direct feedback loop from tariff policy to everyday financial choices. We also see real-world examples of how trade wars reshape markets beyond economics textbooks. German auto exports to the U.S., once a stable growth driver, fell nearly 14% in 2025 after European cars faced higher U.S. tariffs, reversing years of steady expansion. That's not a minor fluctuation. It's structural change in global trade relationships. And let's be clear, this isn't just about one country's businesses losing sales abroad. When foreign firms face higher tariffs or tighter regulations, they often limit purchases of U.S. goods or adjust operations in ways that reduce overall economic integration. That can lower foreign demand for U.S. exports, hurting U.S. manufacturers and reducing economic activity at home. Some proponents argue that tariffs protect certain sectors or promote domestic production. In the short term, that can be true for isolated industries. But the broader data suggests that these gains are often outweighed by losses elsewhere in the economy, including higher costs for consumers, weaker investment climate, and more fragmented supply chains that reduce overall productivity. This dynamic is consistent with decades of economic research showing that high tariffs tend to slow growth and raise costs when economies are deeply interconnected. Ultimately, a global trade war doesn't yield a decisive champion. It redistributes costs and creates structural drag on economies worldwide. Tariff policies may be intended to protect domestic industries or rebalance trade, but the evidence from 2025 shows that they also raise prices, reduce confidence, disrupt global supply chains, and slow growth. All of these effects ripple through markets, households, and businesses in ways that no single country can fully insulate itself from. So, when we ask whether any country can truly win a trade war in a globalized world, the evidence points to the same conclusion. Everyone pays a price, directly through higher costs and indirectly through weaker growth, reduced confidence, and fractured economic ties. Trade may persist, but its benefits are diminished when barriers rise.